everyone for coming again. It's really hard work to attend all these sessions, so I really appreciate it. And I'm learning so much, from the audience, from the questions, and from the discussions. So it's such a wonderful experience for me. The learning is going both ways, I think, in this scenario. So this week, as you can see, we're on week 4 already. We're going to look at the impact of the genocide on cultural production. So we're looking to different geographical areas and comparing what the aftermath was, what were the conditions in the years after the genocide that may have shaped cultural production. We're looking at primarily architecture, as always, because my focus is always architectural history, but we'll also look at some painting and some music and some other areas of cultural production too. So we're looking at how the historical context in the aftermath of the genocide impacted differently in different geographies on the style that was used in art, architecture, and even other areas of cultural production. So, as always, I've split it up into sections. This gives me the ability to cover lots of different areas and perhaps drop out some of them if we don't get enough time, because I think there are lots of interesting issues to discuss this week, so that the discussion with all of you will be especially important this week, I think. So the first part will cover diaspora theory, and in particular how the cultural production in the Armenian diaspora has been interpreted, both by Armenian cultural historians and by other historians of diaspora written large, so historians of diaspora that look at the Jewish diaspora, for instance, and they've looked at the Armenian diaspora from a comparative perspective. So we'll look at some of their ideas about Armenian identity and cultural production, and we'll return to my favourite question of the whole course, the issue of the neo-Armenian style. So why do these relatively traditional designs for Armenian churches keep coming back at various points through Armenian history in different communities? So we'll look at the post-genocide period and neo-Armenian style in that period. We'll look at, in part 2, historical context, so what were the experiences of the deportations and the camps that would have had an impact on cultural producers like ceramicists, painters, musicians, and architects. And we'll look briefly at the very well-known examples of Gorky and Komitas, and the idea of trauma having an impact on artistic production. Then we'll look at the other important context of the failure of the First Republic of Armenia. So what symbols of the state were put in place, what architecture was put in place, and what was the result of the fact that these things were established for the first time and then lost within a short period of time. So how did that have an impact on subsequent identity and artistic production? And then if we have time, we'll focus in the final part on the work of one architect, Leon Nafilian, who's particularly interesting because he lived through this period of change, and he was working in the late 19th century, early 20th century, under the Young Turks, and he had a relatively close relationship with the Young Turks in the turn of the 20th century, and then he changed to a neo-Armenian style later on in the 1920s in his works in the diaspora. So we'll look at him and look at his change in direction and speculate on the reasons for it occurring. So let's start with thinking about diaspora and identity in the period after the genocide. So how did this modern diaspora identity differ from the pre-modern diaspora that we were talking about a few weeks ago? So Anahid Terminassian has written that Armenian diaspora identity was first and foremost a nostalgia for origins. And I think this interpretation has tended to dominate the interpretation of cultural production in the diaspora within Armenian studies, particularly since the 1980s when Terminassian was writing. However, you can see relatively similar interpretations within scholarly works that look at diaspora more broadly and how they interpret the role of the Armenian diaspora and cultural production in the Armenian diaspora within a context of diasporas more generally. So William Safran, who looks at comparative diasporas, he says that he places a great stress on symbols of ethnic loyalty in the Armenian diaspora as well. So he's sort of saying a similar thing to Terminasian, despite the fact that he's not predominantly working on Armenia. He's looking at it comparatively. And he says that it's striking that symbols have served an important role in diaspora communities relating to religion and to the homeland, especially when the homeland has been under the control of a foreign power or a dictatorial regime. And he gives the example of Armenia to exemplify this statement. So both of these interpretations of Terminasian, saying that there's a strong nostalgia for origins, and William Safran saying that symbols that refer to the homeland, like Mount Ararat or like medieval Armenian architecture, that these are particularly strong in the modern diaspora when that homeland has been sort of put out of reach for one reason or another. Whether it's through the trauma of the genocide or through the Soviet occupation and the end of the opportunity of the First Republic. William Safran goes on to identify the symbols in more detail. So what are these symbols? They include the early 20th century proliferation of the instantly identifiable pointed dome of medieval churches, as you can see from the example of Edgemudsin that they were looking back to. These became an institution symbolizing Armenian ethnicity and the most visible expression of Armenianism, to which Armenians came to identify out of a sense of ethnic loyalty. So he doesn't give an explanation of why these instantly identifiable symbols came about. He implies that it was because of the trauma of the genocide, but he doesn't explain in more detail where they came from or what their function was, rather than just identifying that they exist and they're particularly prominent in the Armenian case. So we'll look at, in more detail, an explanation or some explanations for why these symbols came about and why they became particularly prominent in the modern diaspora, such as the instantly identifiable pointed dome of medieval churches that we'll see repeated, particularly from the 1920s onwards. So some theorists looking at Armenian cultural production and Armenian diaspora identity have tended to tie this relatively narrow sort of symbolic vocabulary to the status of victim diaspora. So this used to be a favoured term that was referred to not only the most famous example of the Jewish diaspora, but also to the Armenian diaspora. Of course, the Jewish diaspora would be the sort of prototype, and this description of Robin Cohen describes why the Jewish example can be categorized as a victim diaspora, because of the destruction of Jerusalem and the razing of the walls of the temple, and so Jews had been compelled to desert the land that had been promised to them by God to Moses, and thereafter became dispersed. So there's an idea that Armenians were similarly driven away from the land that was their own promised land, given to them by God. However, I think more recent interpretations of diaspora culture have tried to move away from this interpretation of Armenian diaspora as a victim diaspora, and they've tried to identify the more diverse visual references that you can see in diaspora visual production, and they've tried to make the case that this neo-Armenian style, this reduced vocabulary of symbols came about at a particular time, which was mainly the 1920s and after. And actually before then, there was a sort of a period of instability whereby the cultural producers could have gone in any direction. There was some degree of debate about what cultural forms should be used. So they've argued that we shouldn't tie this limited vocabulary of symbols, the pointed Armenian dome, the Hachkar and so on, to the genocide per se. They say it's not really about the impact of the genocide and about trauma. Instead, it's about the process afterwards of rethinking Armenian identity, and then the context of the 1920s and after that, what happened politically in terms of the occupation of Armenia and the changing directions that came later, rather than the direct impact of the genocide and the result of trauma, and this sort of victim image that has been popular in terms of the characterization of the past. So, for instance, looking at literature, Talar Chahanian, who is working in the United States, she was looking at literary production in the genocides, the subsequent generation to the genocide in Paris. And she has stressed that in this immediate period after the genocide, writers were looking for different kinds of inspiration. They weren't trying to recreate their homeland necessarily. Instead, they were trying to adapt to the new context that they found themselves in, and to find a new kind of visual or literary language that would take them forward rather than looking back. So Nigo Sarafian, writing in Paris in this period after the genocide, around 1929, and this is a quotation from Talar Chahanian's dissertation, the title of which is there below. So he states, in quotes, "We can retain our Armenian essence intact even if we write in foreign languages and on non-Armenian subjects. It is a matter of finding a universal form free from romanticism. We Armenians must exploit to the full our dispersion, our exile. We must push to its limits the Western Armenian destiny in different lands." So this is kind of the opposite, really, of the implications of some of the other interpretations, that it was a cultural production was immediately a nostalgia for origins, or the recreation of the symbols of the homeland in diaspora. Instead, this is actually quite a modernist approach that's trying to move forward, as I said, through a new visual vocabulary rather than recreate the symbols of the homeland. So this is quite similar to the Diasporist manifesto of R.B. Kitaj, who was one of the leading diaspora artists in the 1980s, who said, one of his famous quotations was, "I try to be, along with many artists, forward-looking." So he tries to incorporate his heritage within his art, but to push its sort of destiny in different lands and the visual languages that correspond to his future destiny, rather than nostalgically looking back to the past. So there's the idea that in the generation immediately past the genocide, those that lived through the genocide and moved to Paris, like Sarafian that we just mentioned. So in the generation following that, and even at that same time, there were struggles between different Armenian communal groups. So Hachik Tololyan, sorry about my pronunciation, has looked into the struggles between different communal groups, particularly in the United States, such as the Tashnaks, who were in exile after the Soviets had taken over the First Republic of Armenia and established the Second Republic. So he argues that this was actually a really crucial moment in terms of changing the image of Armenian art and cultural representation. because these different communal groups were struggling over who had the right to speak on behalf of the nation, who had the sort of patrimony over Armenian symbols, and over, the right to own the territory in the future, potentially. And so Hachik Tololian says that it was in this period, actually, during these arguments between the Tashnaks and the Soviets, and that competition over land and over the ability to speak on behalf of the nation, during which homogenized cultural forms emerged and identity was crystallized. And these were clearly connected to the national past and to nostalgia, such as the ethno-symbol of Mount Ararat, which became this sort of ever-present reference, despite the changing regimes that Armenians passed through. Other historians, or literary historians like Talar Chahanian, who was working on the writer that I mentioned a minute ago, Serafian. So she argues that instead the more significant period was actually the post-war period, and that the changing definition and the changing idea of diaspora took place then. So it wasn't so much the debates between the Tashnaks and the Soviets, it was actually later, and the definition of the genocide, or the sort of recognition of the category of the genocide and the beginnings of the struggle over the genocide that took place, and led to the post-war sort of coming together of the diaspora as a single voice, and that this transformation, in fact, was the key point of change that led to this focus on more nostalgic symbols referring to Armenian traditional culture. So she says that the term that we mentioned a few weeks ago, gaguts, or colonies or communities, as I've been corrected, could transform in the post-war period to a collective term of spuk or diaspora, and that this represented a fundamental shift that had an impact on cultural production at this later time. So as I mentioned already, there was in 1948 the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, or better known as the Genocide Convention of 1948. So this defined genocide under the law, and so after this point, Armenians started to rally together and to campaign more heavily for recognition of 1915 under this definition of genocide by law. So, as we see here, on 24th of April 1965, so this was after Stalin's death and the Soviet Union started to get slightly freer in terms of demonstrations of national identity, and what Ronald Sunni called official nationalism was allowed during this period. So there started to be demonstrations, and they focused on this issue of recognition of genocide, according to the definition of 1948. So people like Talar Chahanian have argued that it was this moment and this coming together of the community that was a real sort of turning point in terms of representation, cultural representation. She says, Talar Chahanian, as I've written here, she says that the post-World War II period actually saw the reworking of Armenian identity. So there was a sort of a conscious effort by the diaspora, which now had a more formalized identity, and there was a conscious effort to historicize, contextualize, and narrate the story of dispersion in a coherent and chronological fashion. So there was a sort of official, coordinated attempt by the diaspora to change the history writing of Armenian history, and also therefore to change the cultural representation too. So she implies that it was a more conscious approach to history and also to cultural production due to the existence of this new sort of collective of the diaspora. And so some examples I thought were relevant are this quotation by Haik or Francis Belikian, who wrote Avenir de la Diaspora Armenienne in 1975, and he said, all Armenians, I'll translate directly from the French, all Armenians are easily recognizable since they were either forced migrants or survivors of Armenocide. So there starts to be more of an emphasis on this crucial moment of genocide as shaping Armenian identity and experience, particularly after the 1960s protests. And writers tend to focus more on the impact of genocide and speak more openly about it after these protests in the new formalised environment of the diaspora, the post-war diaspora. So you would think that architectural style would sort of correspond to this in some way, and that you would have a more hybrid style, perhaps in the periods immediately after the genocide, when architects were experimenting in different styles and looking for different styles. And then you would expect to see a crystallization either in the 1920s, if you follow the argument that it was the rivalry between the Tashnaks and the Soviets that created this neo-Armenian style, or in the 1960s, if you followed the argument that it was actually the Genocide Convention and the creation of the Spjök, the collective noun, that was the turning point in terms of cultural identity. But in fact, architecture doesn't seem to follow either of those arguments, because already in 1902 you see the Neo-Armenian style, so already you see the recreation of a medieval Armenian church on the streets of Paris in 1902 in the example of Church of St. John the Baptist. So what could be the explanation for that coming about already before the genocide, before the rivalry between the Tashnaks and the Soviets, before the Spjök identity? And you also see widespread proliferation of the Neo-Armenian style by the mid-20th century. So you see in Antelias in 1940, in Fresno in 1979, and very recently the Cathedral of Gregory the Illuminator in Yerevan in 2001. So this implies that perhaps architecture doesn't really correspond to perhaps the arguments that scholars have put forward about literature and other areas of cultural production. So we'll come back to that in the end through discussing the example of Nephilian. Now we'll go back in time a bit to discuss the experience of the genocide and how this may have had an impact, or how this is traditionally viewed to have an impact on cultural production. So historians have a range of sources available now to find out about the genocide. There are not only Ottoman official documents, although some of them have been identified as being problematic in the past. So obviously when you're using Ottoman official documentation, you have to bear in mind that the vast majority of it will have been destroyed or will have been obviously changed in some form or another. We have large bodies of foreign archive documents, including the consular accounts and the ambassadorial accounts that we have at Kew Gardens just down the road, or likewise you have on the internet. The American government is freely available, so you can search on that online. We also have missionary correspondence, so you can go to the American Board of Foreign Missions in the States and view that in person, or you can also view the books that have been published by the missionaries that are available online too, through websites like archive.org. So there are lots of different books that we can read first-hand accounts of what happened that are available freely online now, thanks to the internet and people digitizing these things. We also have survivors' testimonies that were recorded and are kept in the Durgaryan Library and the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem that have been recently studied and published by Raymond Kevorkian. We also have lots of oral histories that have been recorded by various universities, particularly in the States, and also by the Armenian Genocide Museum in Armenia. So we have no shortage of accounts, but and of course individuals have their own family stories to add to that, so I'm sure everybody here has many stories that they've heard growing up. And more recently we have the phenomenon of published accounts of memoirs of survivors that have given us further insights into individual experiences. This is coming from the perspective of a historian audience rather than an Armenian community audience. So these have been published in English, so they're now widely available, so that historians who are not necessarily Armenian studies historians but could be working on other areas of history can now find out individual testimonies about the genocide. So one of these examples is the text by Kani Kapanian called Goodbye Antura, which was published in 2015. And this tells us the story of how Panian his family was sent away. The men were called away for military service. The women, children and elderly were sent on marches across the Anatolian and Syrian deserts. And then eventually they reached the camps that were in the Syrian desert, and children were sent to orphanages, such as the orphanage that Kani Kapanian was sent to in Antura in Lebanon. So accounts like this give us a first-person account not only of the process of the deportations, the experience of the camps, but what's most significant about this is he describes in detail his experience in the orphanage and the process of turkification that he went through. Islamicization as well. The pressures that were put on children, they were not allowed to use their Armenian language, their names were changed and so on. So it gives us quite a detailed account of how not only the older members of the family were wiped out, how difficult the experiences were for those that survived, and also the cultural genocide that took place in terms of trying to wipe out the Armenian identity of those who had survived, even as children. So this is an example of a description from Kani Kapanian's account, which describes the camps, how desolate they were. He says, I finally understood exactly what the desert was, not a single standing structure, not even a tent. People had improvised shelter by putting together hovels made of their clothing, but they offered scant protection against the sun and the heat. So I think this is significant for us as art historians to bear in mind these extreme physical difficulties those that did survive had to go through. And also that it gives us an interesting glimpse into the bonds that were formed in the camp location. Because he says, in quotes, our neighbours were Armenians from different parts of Sebastia and Kilikia. There were probably 20 or 30,000 exiles just from those areas. From each community tended to stick together. The Armenians of Sebastia or Zeytin or Malatya each had their own neighbourhood within the camp. So that's interesting in terms of how the local traditions and local identities from within the Armenian communities of the Ottoman Empire were retained, and then how they got transported. Despite this attempt at annihilation, they were retained to some degree within the camp and then transported to the new locations, whether in Armenia or United States. So, in other words, there were attempts to eradicate Armenian identity, local identities from the Ottoman Empire, but some traces were retained somehow, whether through discussions in camps about those who were relatively unscathed. So there were many architects who were saved from the deportations or from being killed because of their importance to the local governor or to the central authorities in Constantinople, because they needed architects to continue to build infrastructure and so on. And craftsmen similarly were often saved because of this important role to local governors or to central state. But nevertheless, it still gives us an insight into how difficult these experiences were and the sacrifices that they had to go through, and how these experiences would have tainted their memories for their future production. So also we can talk about displacement. I already mentioned about the camps from the account of Panian. This is an amazing photograph that's from the Hush Hamadian website, that was taken by, likely taken by a photographer called Muradian, who was a resident in the camp for some time. And also we need to bear in mind the experiences of rescue. So perhaps artistic production, those responsible for artistic production were deported. They'd survived death, obviously, because they went on to create in the diaspora afterwards. But nevertheless, they went through very difficult circumstances through the deportation, through displacement, and then potentially, if they were children, through rescue or through Turkification or Islamicization in an orphanage. And the other issue is that most of their heritage from where they had come from, particularly if they were from eastern Turkey, would likely have been destroyed altogether, or would simply be a shell of what it had formerly been. We'll talk about this more next week when we're talking about the Republic of Turkey and the fate of Armenians under the change of the regime. But nevertheless, for now we'll just mention that the majority of the homes, the churches and so on did not survive the genocide in their full form. They were severely diminished after the genocide, if they even remained at all. So there's also this to fit into the sort of worldview, the experience of those who survived and ended up in a new location. So the first example we'll discuss through that context of the experience of deportation and the experience of having cultural heritage destroyed is the example of Arshil Gorky, who's probably known to all of you within this room. So Arshil Gorky is interesting, and I hope we discuss him at length at the end, because of his interpretation and how that's changed through the years. Art historians tended to focus more on his significance within the art historical canon. So art historians always want to tell the story of the development of artistic style through time. So there's a sort of chronological development of different styles that go from the Impressionists to Modernists and Cubists and Surrealists and Dada and all of these different styles that have their own place within the story of the history of art. And so Arshil Gorky's paintings were predominantly interpreted through his place within the story of art as a whole and the development of styles. And his place within that narrative is not insignificant at all. He was a leading abstract expressionist and surrealist artist whose friends were leading names in the art movements of the time, like Jackson Pollock and de Kooning. So he wasn't, a small character on the New York art scene. He was a big star at the time, and for that reason, art historians have tended to just focus on the progression of his works stylistically, how they fit into the narrative about surrealism and abstract expressionism, and how that style developed in the context of his friends' styles in New York. So On the contrary, the narrative that has been put forward by Armenian scholars has tended to focus on his personal story as an Armenian, that he was brought up as Wostanic Andoyan, born in around 1902 near Lake Van in Korkum. He has an extremely traumatic childhood in which his father had already moved away to America, and he was left with his mother and I think sister, and he walked all the way, or he was transported somehow, I think it said walked in the accounts that I've seen, all the way to Yerevan from Van, and upon arrival his mother was incredibly ill and died, so he had this very traumatic childhood through which he was already separated from his father. His father apparently didn't have much interaction with them, and then he witnessed his mother's death. So he moves to America. He changes his name to Gorky, apparently or allegedly because that was his favourite writer, and so he wanted to take on a new identity that was after his favourite writer rather than to connect his identity with his past. And he's an autodidact, so he visited all the galleries in New York and taught himself how to paint on the basis of his observations of great artists like Cézanne and Picasso. So he's very much a sort of a free spirit in that sense, that he wanted to make a fresh start, teach himself art, and become a great artist on his own terms. So many of the writers who either have Armenian background or who are coming from an Armenian studies perspective have tended to focus on the experience of trauma that he lived through witnessing his mother's death. They've stressed how he carried this photograph, which was the last photograph he had taken of him with his mother in Van, and how he took this around in his coat pocket with him everywhere. This is also corroborated by his widow to some extent, Muguch Fielding, who writes about here. This is actually an interview with her that was posted on the Tate Modern's website many years ago. The Tate Modern had a big Gorky retrospective that many of you probably went to. And so as part of that exhibition, I think they tried to incorporate a bit more about the Armenian heritage of Gorky within his representation. And part of that was many statements by Muguch Fielding from an interview with her, through which she was asked about the Armenian dimension to his identity. And in this quotation, she says, in quotes, "He had been brought up on all these tales about members of his family being slaughtered throughout the generations. It was part of his country's terrible history. He told me that during the Hamidian massacres of the Armenian people in 1896, his grandfather had been crucified on the door of his church." And then there's the other description of his experience with the death of his mother as well. So that's not to say that this interpretation of trauma was sort of concocted by Armenians or Armenian studies art historians. It is there. It is documented not only by the tales that Gorky told his wife, but also by the visual evidence, primarily this photograph, but also two of his most famous paintings, which are both called The Artist and His Mother, through which he recreates the image of the photograph, which his wife said that he pinned to the easel when he was painting those paintings. And art historians have often focused on the unfinished nature of these paintings, and in particular the nature of the hands being rubbed off, almost as if he didn't want to stop this sort of interaction with the body of his mother, and with the past in which his mother was still sort of playing a role. So in other words, art historical interpretations have tended to place him within this context of trauma, that this was one of his most significant works when he's viewed within an Armenian studies context because of this experience of trauma, rather than because of his story of migration and adapting to the new environment of America. With the case of Gorky, I think his biographical information does sort of compound this image of trauma, because he also had problems with his wife, he also had cancer, he also had a terrible accident whereby all his paintings were lost in a fire. So this sort of, the result of all these incidents at the same time perhaps led to his suicide. So he is this tragic figure, not just because of the Armenian genocide background, but also because of this personal experience, personal disasters that he lived through too. But nevertheless, it is interesting that the historiography from the Armenian studies side has tended to focus on the trauma rather than on the adaptation and on the sort of what I was saying at the beginning with the example of Kitaj and his Diasporist manifesto, trying to push his destiny in new lands and his visual production. Another example in terms of that's often interpreted in terms of collective trauma is Diaspora, who again I'm sure you're all familiar with his story, so I probably don't need to go through it. So he was a celebrate priest who was trained in the Gevorgian seminary in Etchmiadzin, but at the same time he was a musician and he studied at the Berlin Conservatory and had a detailed knowledge of musical styles in both East and West. He was an ethnomusicologist, so he travelled around the Ottoman Empire and collected traditional songs, not just Armenian ones, but also Kurdish ones and Turkish ones. So he was very interested in collecting the varied, diverse folk music of Anatolia. But he's also significant in terms of his concerts that he gave in Europe. He was significant for introducing Armenian church music to the classical listening world in Europe and spreading the image of Armenian musical culture abroad in the West. But like Gorky, he has a traumatic life story that he was rounded up on April the 24th, 1915, and although he escaped execution himself, he was severely impacted by his experience, and he was kept in a military hospital for post-traumatic stress disorder. Then in 1919 transferred to a Paris hospital where he died in the psychiatric ward. So although he was this incredibly productive musician and ethnomusicologist and scholar, he is often remembered in terms of his traumatic experience at the end of his life. And so his works too, a bit similarly to Gorky's paintings, have been interpreted in terms of the Armenian resonance and their relationship to the traumatic experience of Armenians in the early 20th century. And one key example of this is the crane. Crane, whence do you come? Don't you have news of our land? Is the key refrain. So there's been a study by Michael Pfeiffer, who is from the University of Michigan, who's looked into the image of the crane, and that's really interesting in terms of drawing attention to how this image of the crane circulated, and this refrain actually circulated in different cultures, including Arabic and Persian loanwords in the Armenian version. But then it increasingly started to be a cultural symbol that was understood implicitly to refer to Armenians and the Armenian experience. And this is in some ways related to the 19th century rise of nationalism and cultural nationalism, in particular the rediscovery of ancient mythologies and traditional cultures. So, for instance, writers like Daniel Varusian and Rupen Sevak wrote poems about the crane, which started to, let's say, remind the Armenian audience of its association with Armenian identity and history. And so, yes, as it says, Michael Pfeiffer has said, this started to draw attention to the distinctly unique exile of the Armenians in immutably national terms, and to tell the story through songs like The Crane. And there are also accounts of men walking to their deaths in the genocide singing The Crane. So as a result of not only his biography, but also the composition of The Crane and its linking with Armenian experience of the genocide, and the genocide in particular, Komasas has become another symbol of collective trauma within historiography. So the result of this collective trauma has sometimes been interpreted as giving rise to a new form of activism. So subsequent to the revolutionary movement, subsequent to the non-recognition of the genocide and the increasing frustrations of that, and also the first-hand experience of the genocide as well, and the inheritance of those experiences by subsequent generations. This sort of cumulative trauma has been interpreted as leading to new forms of activism, such as the movement of Operation Nemesis and subsequently Asala. So this kind of cumulative trauma due to non-recognition and also very difficult experiences is encapsulated by the film Ararat by Atom Egeran, which I'm sure you've all seen as well. So the story of Soholman Terlilian, I'm sure you're familiar with that his mother appears to him in a dream, and because of the terrible experiences of his family, he vows to seek vengeance on Talat Pasha and finally killed him in 1921. So there's this idea of trauma causing radicalization and a fight for recognition and revenge. A similar interpretation has been put forward looking at Asala. Asala was the secret army for the liberation of Armenia, which tried to again bring the Armenian cause back into the agenda of world politics through a wave of terrorism in the 1970s and 80s. And a colleague of mine at University of Lincoln has recently published a book that's looking comparatively at militant violence. He looks at a range of different organizations, from people like Asala to jihadis, and he argues that through his research he's found that there's this perception of continually being deprived justice, which has led to the use of violence in many different societies. So that will be something that we can discuss as well at the end. So the next context of significance for artistic production, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the short-lived experiment of the First Republic and the experience of creating the Republic for the first time and creating all the apparatus, the symbols of the Republic, and then having all of that experience taken away within a period of only a few years. There was also the incredibly difficult situation that the First Republic was placed in, so it was almost destined to fail because it was such a inhospitable environment, political environment, social environment, humanitarian environment. So Ronald Sunni states that the survival of Armenia at the moment of the creation of the First Republic depended on Armenians achieving two things. Firstly, overcoming divisions within their own nationality of class, communities and party, and secondly, securing the support, material and military, of one or more great power to preserve an Armenian political entity. So we'll see to what extent they managed to achieve these things, and how important was culture to trying to achieve these things as well. I won't dwell on the history of the First Republic, other than to highlight that it was created in the context of the victories over the Turkish armies that were led by the Turkish independence struggle that was under Ataturk and Kazım Karabekir, and that these wars were incredibly difficult, but included a success at the Battle of Sadrabat, which led to the ability to stabilize some area of territory and to bring refugees there from the genocide. It was all rather hurried and rather chaotic to some extent, that those who already held government in Tbilisi, in Tiflis in Georgia, who were the Tashnak politicians who had control of the city government of Tiflis and also Yerevan, they travelled down to take control of the First Republic of Armenia. And there was this idea that, as Ronald Sunni writes here, the Republic of Armenia, and there was this idea that, as Ronald Sunni writes here, these politicians, these Tashnak middle-class politicians, didn't necessarily have the experience of dealing with humanitarian crises that they were to experience when they travelled down to Yerevan. He states, there the genteel politicians of Tiflis were faced by tens of thousands of starving and homeless refugees, cholera, typhus, and the nearby threat of the Turkish army. And by the mid-1919 period, approximately 200,000 had died. So, in other words, these were not easy conditions to establish a republic. But there was, the fighting language was there, particularly in the Tashnak politicians that headed the First Republic. This is a quotation from Alexander Hatisyan, who was the second Prime Minister of the First Republic and a Tashnak politician. He says, on this context, this difficult context of the establishment of the Republic of Armenia was born of the sacred Armenian blood spilled in abundance on the plain of Ararat. The Armenian people took in a deep breath of consolation, seeing the name of Armenia recorded, even if in small print, in the corner of a world map. So this implies that this, even if it was short-lived, this was a moment of huge significance for Armenians across the world, just the establishment of a national republic. But of course, as the Prime Minister of the Republic, he would emphasize its significance perhaps more than others might do. So not only the Republic was established, but it had to quickly have put in place the essentials for governance, not only this sort of government apparatus, institutions, but also the symbolic apparatus of the state. So they needed to decide on what an Armenian national flag would look like. There are some different interpretations that I've heard over the years about this, so again, I'd be really interested to see your stories, to hear your stories at the end. So some say that the colours were chosen because these were the colours of military units, and obviously in the context of the battles that had taken place, the military units had a very important role within the new nation. Others say that the tricolour was chosen to fit with European flags, and that this was just sort of quick, let's make something that is recognisable as a national flag. Which colours shall we have? There's an interesting article on Yerevan Report, the online newspaper, that says, that gives quotations from Simon Vratsian, another Tashnak politician who was active at the time, and that gives the explanation of some kind of background rationale for the choice. He says that, in quotes, the Armenian people who established their freedom with blood had to rebuild the country with patience and live freely and happily under the blue sky. So there's the idea that red blood, blue sky, and what was the orange, yellow? Labour, the labour of the Armenian people. I've never found much information about this, so again I would be really interested if anybody has any further anecdotes, but I've read that the painter, the very famous painter Wharton-Durgaryan, proposed a rainbow flag because, in quotes, we are an Oriental nation. So that's an interesting negotiation or discussion that took place behind the scenes, perhaps. Were they going to use a European model, or were they going to produce something that was showing their difference? Another point that's really interesting is that painters and architects like Wharton-Durgaryan, Alexander Tamanyan, Arshak Fetvadjian, a lot of these were active in the Ottoman or the Russian empires, had a training within the imperial systems there, then moved over to the First Republic, and some of them became especially well known and actually had their golden age under the Soviets. So a lot of these cultural producers were very adept at rethinking symbolism to change with the different regimes of the time. That's something we'll look at in the final week when we look at Soviet Yerevan. Another thing was, of course, the coat of arms that had to be created. This was put together by the architect Alexander Tamanyan. As I mentioned, Tamanyan was already active in the Russian Empire. He trained in St. Petersburg. He made a number of different Moscow and St. Petersburg mansions. And then he migrated over to the First Republic and started to work there. Although this period is a bit shady in his history. And then later he's best known for constructing Soviet Yerevan under Stalin. But in the First Republic he supposedly designed the coat of arms. It's a mixture of different symbols of Armenian dynasties. You've got Mount Ararat in the middle. You've got the two eagles looking at one another of the Artaxid dynasty, the lion of the Bagratuni dynasty, the double-headed eagle of the Arsakid dynasty, and the lion with the cross of the Rubenid dynasty, as well as additional symbols like a sword, broken chains, wheat ears, feathers, ribbons, and so on. And there's the idea that he was inspired by old coins, such as the ones from the Kilikian kingdom and medieval architecture like the ruins of Ani. But again, there are some interesting behind-the-scenes discussions about whether the First Republic should even have a coat of arms, because it wasn't, a sort of monarchy. It wasn't a traditional monarchy. It was a sort of socialist nationalist creation. So this quotation sheds some light on the arguments behind the scenes, that it resembled the old and knightly ideas of past centuries and did not symbolize the new Armenia. But others said the country was facing numerous issues and there was no time for debate on aesthetics. Also, we have the government building. So as I said before, there's some evidence that Alexander Tamanyan moved from Moscow and St. Petersburg to work in Yerevan during the First Republic and constructed some of the infrastructure at that time, including the first government building. And the currency, there's also currency in stamps, but some of these have been argued to be fake, so we're not sure to what extent these are legitimate products of the time, but they're interesting because of this medieval symbolism that started to be depicted on them. Many of these motifs are coming from the archaeological excavations of Ani and Svartnots that were taking place in the late 19th century. And other medieval Armenian kingdoms. And it's clear that the impact or the legacy of medieval Armenian culture was important for the leadership of the First Republic. The leader, Avedis Aharonian, said, in quotes, "For us to know who we were and who we are, it is enough to see the ruins of Ani. Such glory and honor, what a magnificent demonstration of culture and civilization of the Bagratuni dynasty. That's when we understand the worth of our forefathers, of their creations, of their armies of brave men." So the image of medieval Armenia and the capital of Ani in particular seems to have been a sort of a rallying cry for the leadership of the First Republic. And that might explain why, despite the monarchical references, it was accepted within the coat of arms and so on. Okay, so we'll briefly mention that the Paris peace talks came around in January 1919 to 1920. Armenia was represented not just by the Republic of Armenia, but also by the Armenian national delegation led by Bohos Nubar. And so these two parties representing, you could say, quite different cultures, came together at the table, the negotiating table, to try and ask for territory on behalf of Armenia, an Armenian national sort of cause. So as most of you already know, or all of you already know, that this was the area of territory that was requested at the Paris peace talks, that spread from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So it was a large proportion of what was at that time still the Ottoman Empire, or Western Armenia. It was including areas like Adana, so that they could have access to the Mediterranean Sea and the trade potential that would give the Republic of Armenia. So perhaps because of its ambition, the plans were rejected, and shortly after the Republic of Armenia ceased to exist. This was also because of the very difficult political situation with the rise of the Turkish armies on the doorstep under the Turkish national movement, the armies led by Turkish General Kazım Karabekir, who were threatening to come over to the border on one side, and then on the other side you had the rise of the Bolsheviks threatening to take over on the other side. So in the end, there's a lot of sort of speculation about what happened behind doors and the agreements that took place. In the end, the Red Army crossed into the border, and Armenia was declared under Soviet control. And of course, there was immediate dissemination of propaganda to say how happy Armenians were. Proud Armenian workers welcomed the advance of the 11th Red Army into the city of Yerevan. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think this is really important, this short-lived experience of nationhood and how it was so rapidly and so violently and perhaps even underhandedly taken away from Armenians in this very murky circumstance in 1920. So I've got a bit of time, so I'll luckily discuss my own research for a bit. So as I've said many times, I'm an architectural historian, and I predominantly work on Armenians from the Ottoman Empire, but some interesting examples have sort of fallen into my hands because I've been incredibly lucky. I can't actually remember when I found out about Leon Nafilian, but I discovered that the archives of, it's called the City of Architecture in Paris. It's a huge collection of documents that relate to the history of architecture that's in Paris. And this has a huge archive that belongs to an architect called Leon Nafilian. So I happened to discover that, I think, by chance, although I've also been told in the past that descendants of his are still alive, and so perhaps I might follow it up in the future with more research, get me in contact with them. At this moment in time, however, my research is purely based on placing him in context in his early years in the Ottoman Empire, his education in Paris, and then trying to speculate about his change of style in the 1920s as his career progressed. So I have to admit I haven't done a lot of research on this individual. It's just a project that I've tinkered about with from time to time, and so any pointers, any discussion will be greatly appreciated at the end. So Leon Nafilian, he was an architect who came from the Ottoman Empire. He was actually from, I think he was from Trabzon, as far as I remember. It's been quite a long time since I've done research on him, so it's been a bit clouded in my mind, but I'm fairly sure that he was from Trabzon, and there were actually a couple of architects from Trabzon at the time that came from wealthy families and then were educated in Paris. So he moved to Paris and attended the Collège Saint-Barbe, which was an elite prep school, which was the same prep school actually that the Balian family attended and many other elites in the 1840s. So this was really starting to be an Ottoman Armenian tradition to attend this very elite prep school in Paris. So there he interacted with people like the Balian family, but also very influential French architects like the Labrousse brothers, who were the leading romantic rationalist architects who I talked about a few weeks ago, and whose brother was the head of the school at the time. So they had this sort of classical humanist education in philosophy, in classics, in modern languages, but also they had exposure to European drawing techniques and things like that. What's really significant about Nafilian, though, is that he was one of the few architects from the Ottoman Empire to actually graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts. So many other architects sort of dipped in and out, like the Balian family. As far as I could find out from my research, they didn't seem to graduate, they just attended classes here and there. But Nafilian was unusual in that he stayed and graduated, so he had a really thorough education as a Beaux-Arts architect. So what did this mean at this moment in time? It meant that he would study for long periods of time in architectural workshops, where the architecture students would draw up these elaborate projects alongside one another, and they would be given a brief, like, for instance, design a palace in the style of Barberini. So they would go away and work to the brief and come up with a project, and then that project would be judged at the end of the process. So it was a very sort of interesting, collaborative but competitive environment in those workshops, where they would form quite strong bonds with their fellow students, but they would also strive to be ever more impressive and ever more creative in the atelier. So another really important idea that was being taught at the École des Beaux-Arts at this time was the importance of the study of historical buildings. So they started to have a course in the history of art and architecture, and they had a much more scientific approach to the study of history of architecture under the French neo-Gothic architect Viollet-le-Duc, who implemented it, and then he went away and they developed it under somebody else. But nevertheless, it remained central to the education of the École des Beaux-Arts from the 1860s onwards. So they would have to, in their workshops, study historical buildings in detail and recreate these historical buildings. So they had a strong familiarity with the ground plans, with the facades, and various structural decorative aspects. Leon Nafilian seems to have been especially interested in what was called at the time Oriental art and architecture. As a subject of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps this isn't surprising, but he was also very interested in not only studying Ottoman architectural history, and he had within his library, we know the contents of his library because it was actually sold at auction, so you can find online a full book list of his library, which is absolutely fascinating for somebody studying his sort of intellectual formation as an architect. So within his the list of books that he possessed in his library, we have things like the very first history of Ottoman Turkish architecture that was written in the 1870s. We have things like the works by Priest Aven, who was studying Arab art, so he was also interested in other Oriental traditions, a bit like Sopon Vizirjan, who we talked about last week, so Turkish, Ottoman, Persian, Arab, all of these traditions. So what did he create as a result of this education and these interests? His early works, when he moved back to the Ottoman Empire immediately after he graduated, are in quite a striking Ottoman revival style. He doesn't actually have that many works. I've only been able to locate one or two works in the immediate aftermath of his graduation at the turn of the 20th century. And one of these works is this building, which is a bank headquarters building in the quarter of Istanbul called Karaköy, which is this area by the ferry boat terminal where there's a street of banks. And it was very important in the 19th century because you had all of these bank headquarters right next to one another, and they were all in a very sort of Europeanizing style and a very big, impressive set of buildings. So he constructed one of his first post-graduation works there in this line of banks. And what's different about it is, although it follows the other bank buildings in that it's this very huge, elongated sort of institution and apartment building fusion, you can already see recognizable Ottoman revival elements like the pointed arch, which is looking to the early Ottoman architecture of Bursa, these interesting niche shapes that again look back to early Ottoman architecture, so pre-Constantinopolitan architecture, going back to the first Ottoman capital of Bursa from the 15th century. So he's reviving this early Ottoman architectural form and putting it on a modern architectural template of the bank headquarters. Up here you can also see turquoise tiles, although the photograph doesn't really show, but he's put turquoise tiles on the exterior, which is also interesting because in Ottoman buildings tiles didn't tend to be on the exterior, they tended to be on the interior, in the Topkapı Palace or in the mosques. So displaying them on the exterior was a sort of rethinking of the traditional art form of the Ottoman ceramic. And there are some other traditional details like this marble balcony with this relief carving and this overhanging eave at the top. Several of these aspects would then be used on what would become the first national style, which was the style of architecture that was associated with the Turkish Republic, which was popularized under Turkish architects called Vedat Tek and Kemalettin Bey. So it's really interesting that this style was first experimented with by Armenian architects like Leon Nafilian. You can explain this in terms of the political atmosphere of that time, the 1908 revolution, and the close relationship of people like Nafilian with the Tashnak party and the Young Turks, and how they were sort of hoping to work together at that moment in time, and the sort of enthusiasm for the future that they shared. And you can see lots of art forms like this Kütahya plate, which says, "Long live the Constitution, freedom, brotherhood, equality," from the 10th of June 1908. So we often forget that between the Hamidian massacres of 1894-96, you had this sort of revival of hope and collaboration between Turks and Armenians and other non-dominant groups in this period of 1908 to around 1911-1912. You also have the context that I've mentioned lots of times before of the discoveries from the archaeological excavations at Ani in the late 19th century in Zvartnots Cathedral. So the knowledge of these medieval styles just starts to be circulated on a much bigger scale in the years of the early 20th century. So this gives rise to a sort of a shift in artistic models, not just the political environment. And you start to see more academic study of Armenian medieval architecture and the promotion of the idea that the form, or the sort of essential racial form as expressed through architecture of the Armenian people, should be the centrally planned and domed form. And these kind of ideas were put forward by art theorists like Josef Strugovsky, who were working in Central Europe in the 1920s. So these changing contexts created, or perhaps it was even the political context that I've also mentioned, I haven't mind yet, these things created a change in style when Leon Nephilian moved to Paris. So around 1923, this is the earliest example that I can find where he's moved to a Neo-Armenian style. This is the tomb of Khanjan Zef in Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, and you can see that already it's got this sort of grapevine scroll that's very much like the decoration, the carved decoration of Zvartnots. It's got these basket capitals. Sorry, there's not much detail, but these are these very distinctive capitals that are shaped like a sort of bulging basket that you can see in the cathedral at Zvartnots. So he's already incorporating these very archaeological references to medieval Armenian architecture through this tomb. Then, in 1924 to 1927, he designs the Church of St. Gregory the Illuminator in Cairo. And again, you can see clear archaeological or sort of precise references to medieval Armenian prototypes, not just the conical dome of the church itself, but also the ornament like this stepped vault, which comes from the Noravank church or monastery in Armenia. And another interesting project around the same time indicates that he had these two directions and he could go in either way. So this was a memorial to Bogos Nubar Pasha that was planned for Heliopolis, this suburb in Cairo, around 1930 but never built. And I think this is particularly interesting in terms of showing the options that were available to him as an architect and to his patron. Because this example doesn't show great detail, but you can see that it's a hatchcar, basically. It's a huge hatchcar with a bust of Bogos Nubar Pasha in front of it. And the other one is this sort of modernist relief sculpture of Bogos Nubar Pasha on a very simplified sort of neoclassical modernist relief, basically, with these fluted columns, Corinthian type columns, but simplified in a modernist style. So this is just to show what the artistic models were, these hatch cars, these medieval cross stones. The Wharton-Durgaryan church is probably the model for the Cairo church, because it has this long hall with a dome on the centre. The next work I wanted to just mention in terms of even more medieval Armenian references is the Maison Armenienne Paris, which was the student house as part of the University of Paris that was constructed with the financial assistance of the AGBU, the Armenian General Benevolent Union of Bogos Nubar Pasha. So again, under the patronage of Bogos Nubar, there seems to be a collaboration with Nephilian to develop the Neo-Armenian style, or the Armenian medieval revival style in Paris in the 1920s. So again, if you look to the detail, this carving is a copy of the frieze of Akhtamar Cathedral in Lake Van. It's got all these little animals carved into it in a lovely sort of scrolling design. You have the stepped design of Noravank again, and up here as well. And there are many different historical references that you can see throughout. So here's the stepped pattern that he's recreating from Noravan, and here is the frieze that he's recreating there. And these are some more examples that perhaps again show collaboration between AGBU and Nephilian in the 1920s, although I'm not sure about the details of these. I need to do more research. So that's Kumkapı School, and that is Nubarashen Eye Clinic in Yerevan. So an important context for the changes of the 20s, although this wouldn't have an impact on the early 20s because Yerevan wasn't completed until the 1930s and begun in 1924, I think it was. So this is more in terms of the subsequent designs of Nephilian rather than his 1920s works. But in the mid-1920s to 1930s, you had the Soviet Union taking control of the Neo-Armenian style to some extent. That you had the construction of the entire capital of Yerevan in the Neo-Armenian style by the architect Alexander Tamanyan. And so he was using exactly the same references that Nephilian was using in his Parisian works. He was using the same, you can see the same relief from Aksamari Lake Van. You can't see the Noravan stepped vault as far as I know, but you can see many similar motifs that show that Tamanyan was drawing from the same stylistic models, even if he wasn't aware of Nephilian's work directly. So there starts to be a situation that Alexander Tamanyan and the sort of the cult of patrimonial historicism through the architecture of Yerevan and the appropriation of the Neo-Armenian style creates a sort of a turning point for Nephilian and for the diaspora as a whole, perhaps, that the Neo-Armenian style is now claimed by Stalinist Yerevan, and so they perhaps have to find a new direction. And so after this date, you tend to see more modernist styles that are not perhaps looking so much towards Neo-Armenian models, at least in the works of Leon Nephilian that I've seen so far. So that's my very tentative conclusion that it is more related to the architectural context and this patrimony that's then taken up by Soviet Yerevan that changes the style. But the reasons for the rise of the style are still something that we need to look into further, I think, and they vary from place to place. I wanted to draw your attention to a recent article in this journal, Etudes Armenian Contemporary, that is written by Vahe Tashjian and Joseph Rustam, and this is looking at this very issue that we discussed today, the rise of the Neo-Armenian style, particularly in the churches of the Lebanon. And he's talking about the impact of the Cairo church by Nephilian on the Lebanese church architecture. So that implies that that design of Nephilian was particularly influential within the diaspora. But he implies that the design actually came from, I think, the priest of the Armenian church in Cairo rather than from the architect. So that's another thing that we might want to look into and discuss. So, yeah, thank you for listening. I think that's